Hey everybody, Zach Wolf here with another great Top 5 Tuesday. This week on Top 5 Tuesday, it's the top 5 worst Texas statutes for civil litigation. These are the statutes that affect my law practice area, which is civil litigation. I thought it would be interesting to talk about the 5 worst ones. And what better place to talk about statutes than right here outside the room where it happens, the place where the game is played and the sausage gets made. I'm here at the Texas State Capitol. So let's get started. Worst Texas statutes for civil litigation. Number 5, kind of a surprise, it's the Covenants Not to Compete Act. Now some of you are saying, whoa, Zach, you are a non-compete lawyer and the non-compete statute, that's a big part of your practice. Yeah, that's true. And it's not a terribly unreasonable statute. It's actually fairly well written in terms of accomplishing its purpose. My beef with the Covenants Not to Compete Act is really just from a broad public policy perspective. In my personal opinion, Texas would be better off if we had a rule that said you can only have a non-compete when it's in connection with the sale of a business. When you sell a business, you need to be able to transfer the goodwill of the business, and the only way to really effectively do that is to have a non-compete. So it makes sense in that situation. In other situations, I don't like non-competes because you are binding people, particularly customers, who never signed that non-compete. There's a public interest in free competition that is not served by non-competes, in my opinion. Now, I still represent clients who have people sign non-competes, and I'll keep doing that under the law that we have. But I think the Covenants Not to Compete Act is not such a great statute for Texas public policy. The number 4 worst Texas statute for civil litigation is one I've been talking about a lot lately, the TCPA, the Texas Citizens Participation Act. The main problem I have with the TCPA is that it's essentially a piece of special interest legislation because it singles out one kind of lawsuit, although it's a broad kind of lawsuit, and establishes special rules for that kind of lawsuit. Now, in this case, the interest groups that backed it were fairly broad. It was not one narrow group. And so it's not as bad as some other special interest legislation, but to me it still suffers from the same defect, which is that it's applying different rules to one kind of litigation than to other general types, to me without really any compelling public policy rationale for doing so. And of course, if you've watched any of my videos or read my blog posts, you know that the TCPA was not written very well because the definitions in it are so broad that it has expanded to apply to all kinds of lawsuits it was never intended to apply to. The number 3 worst Texas statute for civil litigation is the Texas Medical Liability Act. This is the statute that establishes special rules for medical malpractice suits. This was a key component of tort reform. And in this case, again, it's not so much that the result is so terrible, but it does things like, for example, in a medical malpractice suit, you have to get an expert report at the beginning of the case before you've even had any discovery. And if you don't have an expert report, your case could be dismissed. Now, that might be a good idea, or might not, for litigation in general, but why should we have that special rule for doctors? We don't have that rule for other kinds of malpractice cases. A legal malpractice case doesn't require an expert report at the beginning of the case. An architectural malpractice case doesn't have that requirement. You could go on and on. Now, some people will say there was a medical malpractice crisis and it was limiting the availability of doctors. I'm no expert on that, but color me skeptical. So that's why the special Texas statute for medical malpractice claims comes in at number 3. Oh, and also the cap on pain and suffering damages that is part of that doesn't make any sense to me either. The number 2 worst Texas statute for civil litigation is the Texas Residential Construction Liability Act, affectionately known as TRCLA. Now, this is another piece of special interest legislation. You notice a theme emerging here, but it was basically a statute backed by the construction industry, the residential home builders who wanted to be shielded from lawsuits. So it establishes some special rules that apply to suits against builders, for example, for construction defects in building a home. Now, those special rules are not really so terrible, but again, it's really the principle of it that bothers me. Why should we have this special interest set of rules just because residential builders were a powerful lobby that had good lobbyists and made a lot of campaign contributions? That doesn't make good public policy sense to me. Finally, the number 1 worst Texas statute for civil litigation is the Texas Residential Construction Commission Act. This one was tied to number 2, the Residential Construction Liability Act, but this took it a step further and established a special commission for residential construction claims, and it was just a mess. If you did any construction litigation back when this statute was in effect, you probably know that it just created all kinds of questions and problems. It didn't make much sense. The commission didn't really seem to do much, and fortunately this statute died and we no longer have the Texas Residential Construction Commission. So this is one case where the folks in the legislature in the building behind me, I think they finally came around and they got it right and they let it die. So that's my number 1 worst Texas statute for civil litigation. I think in general, civil litigation would probably be better off if the legislature just didn't mess with it. Judges aren't perfect, but I think judges and Texas courts do a pretty decent job of handling the Texas litigation system without a lot of meddling for the legislature. If it were up to me, that's how it would be most of the time. But of course, I don't get to make the rules. These guys do, and so it is what it is. So those are my top 5. Maybe you have another statute that you think is really bad. If so, let me know. And hey, thanks for watching.